So I'm going to start tonight with a couple of opening remarks and updates about what's going on in the world. For those who don't know me, you knew I'm Keisha Rogers, and this is going to be the third of a series of classes that we're doing on Lyndon LaRouche's economics from the book So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. And Ron is going to be giving the presentation to get us started with the dialogue today on LaRouche's economics. Ron Bettag here. So before we get into it, and this is going to be a very loose discussion. We hope we'll have a lot of questions, but also to give you a sense of the picture of what's going on in the world. First of all, I'd like to say for people who may not have had an opportunity to attend a very fascinating event we had here in Houston on this past Thursday with the Schiller Institute. We held a seminar forum titled "A New Paradigm: Peace Through Economic Development, the Role of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Will the U.S. join?" And this was held with the Schiller Institute co-sponsoring the event at the Texas Southern University on Thursday, February 16th. And I just have to say it was quite extraordinary, and it's indicative of the shift that I will go through in a moment of what's going on in the world. And really, it really characterizes the role of LaRouche's understanding of people-to-people relations in economics. This is not about geopolitics and how nations are divided against each other, but how do you bring nations together by recognizing the creative potential of every single human being. And I'll just have to say, with this event on Thursday, that's exactly what you saw. You had people attending from all different walks of life, backgrounds, nationalities, and then the panelists were from 2 different countries, 3, from the United States, from a representative from Egypt, and representative from China, all talking about the importance of what China's doing, the role of the Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, and why it's imperative that the United States join in this very beautiful perspective for mankind that's being laid out. And this beautiful perspective has been the long-term work and fight over the past 40 years of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. And I just wanted to start off by, first of all, also expounding on that by letting you know about an event that just took place in Denmark this past weekend, or
last night.
Actually, yeah, it was last night, Copenhagen. And so this was with the Schiller Institute, also co-sponsored by the Russia House in Copenhagen and the China Cultural Center. The opening of the ceremony and event, this international event that took place last night, started with the chairman of the Schiller Institute in Copenhagen, Tom Gillisberg, who said that we have a unique moment in world history where the potential is there for the United States to join the new paradigm of economic development sweeping the world. You also had remarks from the spokeswoman of the Russian-Danish dialogue. She said that a dialogue of cultures can lead to peace in the world. They were also, anyway, she said that a dialogue of cultures can lead to peace in the world, and as the event went on, just to give you a sense of how that dialogue of cultures really unfolded throughout this event, where it was described, give me 1 second here. As the event was described as gifts of beautiful music and beautiful dance. Says they came from around the world, they came bearing gifts, not gifts you could touch with your hands, but gifts that touch your soul. Speaking of the performers for this beautiful musical dialogue of cultures concert that took place in Copenhagen, of over 200 guests attending last night. It consisted of children playing Russian folk songs and balalaikas, and a baritone who sung on 200 stages. He performed Mozart and Gounod. Also, you had from China a very musical young science student who played many flutes and sang Chinese love songs and sang a duet with one of our Copenhagen members. From Indonesia, you had a traditional dancer, and from Ghana, you had two young men who sang and played a religious song and a song about when we work together, we are stronger than when we stand alone. And you also had opera singers from Denmark and Sweden, 3 female opera singers who sang songs and arias from Schubert, Verdi, Dvorak, and Sibelius. And then you also had one of our members, Schiller Institute members, another in Copenhagen, who is a very profound pianist, with his mother who plays the violin, they both played Beethoven's Romance for violin and piano. And this is something that we're going to be having posted on our Schiller Institute Denmark website, so you can learn more about it there. And I think it's important to, I was pretty fascinated by this because it gives you a sense that what the LaRouche movement and our international movement represents is something powerful. It's something more powerful than just a political fight. The political fight really starts from the standpoint of a higher identity of the human being and the human mind, and how you actually bring about the quality of human beings, which is creative, which is in the image of the Creator, which is expressing the beauty of every single human being. And this is also why there's been a series of articles that are now coming out. There's going to be 4 articles covering the role of Lyndon LaRouche. And the first, and this is being covered by a journalist by the name of Joseph Ford Cato in the San Francisco Review of Books. He's done 2 of these articles already so far, of interviews he's done with Lyndon LaRouche now at the age of 94 years old, and going through his role of what he's represented in impacting the world over these years. So in the first interview, he titles, Lyndon LaRouche says Donald Trump has created, quote, the possibility of a revival of the U.S. economy. And in the opening of the interview, which we're also republishing in Executive Intelligence Review, parts of it, he says, people have said a great many things about Lyndon LaRouche over the years. To be fair, he has shared more than a bit about his own views, and why not? At 94, he has a lifetime of experience in traversing the maze of politics, economics, science, and cultural pursuits that make our world go round. While LaRouche's claim to fame is principally of fiscal nature, his LaRouche-Riemann method is perhaps the most accurate economic forecasting model yet devised. The man has delved into so many different facets of the human experience that one can legitimately elevate him to polymath status. Whether one should read his views on classical music or space technology, it is a wonder that the single fellow is capable of holding so much knowledge about such a diverse array of topics. Even in the case that his views are found to be disagreeable, it must be admitted that he knows his stuff. So, and it goes on later to say, I say that nobody is perfect. I also say that given his age and multitude of life lessons, he should be deemed a living historical monument. So I think that there's more people that have to come to that understanding and determination as to why Lyndon LaRouche is a living historical monument and why he's continuing to be here to share his discoveries, his vision, his mission with every one of us. And we're seeing that being carried out through what is happening around the world. Now, I gave you the beautiful aspect of it first but we cannot go without saying that there are people who don't want you to have that beautiful future and to see that great potential for mankind because their policy is chaos, destruction, and war. And that is exactly what was warned by a close collaborator with our new president, Donald Trump, who made it clear what is coming around, what is actually the intention around the attacks on President Trump, coming from the neocons, the warmongers, and the people who Trump defeated because he made clear that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were going to continue the policies of war in Syria and elsewhere. And that's exactly what they are completely enraged, that their policies are being defeated, that the world is moving in a different direction. And I would just say, Roger Stone, who has been in the institution of the presidency for many years, a 40-year friend of President Trump, he interviewed Lyndon LaRouche just about a month or so ago, actually right after the presidential election, to get his views on the Trump administration. And he also he worked very closely in the Nixon and Reagan administration. So during this interview with RT, Stone really captured the cause of the hysteria, anti-Trump hysteria, by saying, quote, "The real issue here, in my opinion, is that Donald Trump does not want to go to war with the Russian state over Syria. He favors détente and hard-headed negotiations with President Putin in the hopes that we can live in peace and perhaps work together to crush ISIS." So Trump was the peace candidate. The military and industrial complex in this country is very upset with his election. Thus, this allegation about Russian interference in our elections, which I stress again, is entirely unproven. He also says, "I never thought I would ever see the day when Russian media is less censored than media in the United States, but that's the case," end quote. So, and I'll just say, there's just one more quote from Mr. Stone here. He's asked by RT why Russia is treated as the boogeyman in the West. And he says, quote, "Because the neocons have to justify their intended war in Syria. They have made it very clear, I should say, Ms. Clinton made it very clear, that if elected president, she would have expanded the proxy war in Syria, and I think brought the United States and Russia to the brink of world war. Thank God we have stepped back from that under President Trump. Like my mentor, Richard Nixon, I prefer détente. If Brezhnev and Richard Nixon can get together to negotiate strategic arms limitations, then Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin can get together to negotiate peace. I think this is entirely possible, end quote. So I think it's entirely possible too. When they decide to bring in LaRouche, it makes it more possible because Lyndon LaRouche has made it very clear that he understands what the means of negotiating peace consist of. And you also have right now that in the, as we speak, a very important summit is going on in Munich. There's a Munich Security Conference taking place. And just another example of the move toward an understanding that the world cannot accept and cannot go with the threat of nuclear war, coming from the Foreign Secretary of China, Foreign Secretary Wang Yi, who says, who warned that at the Munich conference that Obama's policy of doing nothing but imposing sanctions was leading to war. He said, quote, "Today, what we see is nuclear tests, sanctions, nuclear tests, and then sanctions again," end quote. Then it goes on to say, quote, "This negative cycle should not continue because the ultimate end result could be something that no one can bear. It's a situation where everyone loses," end quote. And he goes on to suggest that that there is a possibility to resume six-part talks, negotiations. Quote, we should work to bring the parties back to the table." So, as said, there is a future that the world wants to, a beautiful future of non-war, non-isolationist and geopolitics, unipolar world. All of that is being eliminated. And people of the world are set that nations are going to actually work together for the common good, the common interest of all nations, of all mankind, and of all people. And so I think that I wanted to leave those open remarks because as we continue to go through the series of economics classes, it's going to better equip us for being world leaders, world citizens, as Mr. LaRouche understands, and as Mrs. LaRouche and what we've developed over these past decades with our international organization, our political movement around the world, in actually bringing people into this beautiful perspective. You have to know how to crush and destroy that which wants to take that potential away from mankind. And I think that we're on the verge of doing that right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Ron so that he can open up the discussion.
Well, this is addressing chapter 3 on the thermodynamics, so it actually gets into what are actually the processes going on, and not just the processes, but how do you measure them and measure them accurately if you bring to affect them as human beings. And last week we discussed this question of relative potential population density, that the real measure of society in an economy is not money. It's actually whether your population is living and functioning in a higher and higher capability, higher and higher technologies, allowing you to have more and more people in the overall process, becoming per capita and per area cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So you're going to different technologies. And so we had a discussion on that and what actually goes into that, because then the crucial measurement of whether you have a population that is capable of that is exactly what Keisha was just going through, that you have to have a population that's capable of understanding these higher dynamics and then replicating them and moving in even to a higher level. So really the same insight that comes about in terms of a scientific breakthrough and the expression of that is the same kind of conception that goes into composing a classical musical piece, because the piece itself is reflecting that kind of development through the whole piece, where the idea of the piece is unfolded through time. And it's the same way in an economy. How do you think 50 years down the road to be able to create what you need to sustain that population? So we'll read a little bit from the book itself. That lays out a, that perspective in Lindstrom. What are you actually looking at as this kind of defined system? But I'd like to show one slide before we start, if it shows up without the lights being off, because it actually identifies also the fight that's going on that Keisha just referenced, in that you have, not everybody measures the economy in the same manner as we'll go to tonight, because there are people obviously who measure it in terms of money. It's not up there, but we'll see if we need it. So most people have followed some of the program over the last years, where we've basically been pumping about $85 billion a month through the Federal Reserve into buying up bad debt off of various banks. So this derivative debt at the time this was done, and I don't see a date here.
Like
Yeah, 2012. The derivative level here is listed at 708 trillion. The other area, the arrow down here points to the U.S. economy, which has a little bit of inflation and everything in there, also not all productive, and that's 15 trillion. So you have, just in this, I just wanted to use this to bring up the irony that Trump, as president, recently said he'd like to put $15 trillion of investment into physical development of the real economy.
Did he say 15? I said 1. I thought he said
one, you're right. I read the 15 off here.
Yeah.
1 trillion into rebuilding infrastructure. Yesterday, I think it was Alan Greenspan, a key player for Goldman Sachs, that launched this whole thing, took down Glass-Steagall and everything. He's saying we can't do that because that 1 trillion would affect the stability of the financial system. And he's absolutely right. He's going to write it off.
There's nothing real in that big thing.
So you want to switch then to the second one? I'll just do this and then we'll go on to the no, next slide. It's the should be the. This actually represents what Mr. LaRouche is talking about as we move, as we talked last week, from say wood is the basis of your fuel, to coal, to petroleum, to fusion, fission, and then fusion. You're coming not up in just in terms of what energy you're using. You're also developing, each of these fuels have a greater density. So the measurement is not just what are you using for energy, but energy flux density. And we went through that last week. If people have any questions on that, they can come back to that. But it's this dynamic that creates a situation where you see you obviously have not only an expanding population capable of being sustained, but you need more and more people to sustain that. And this is where you get into the fundamental questions that we'll develop tonight in terms of how do you measure these things, because you get caught in these discussions that if you do this, then you're going to outrun your ability to use your resources. So I'd like to, for Mike to, just turn the light back on, Mike can read this section of Lynn's book. This is on chapter 3, page 42.
Our initial approximation now proceeds. Divide the total energy throughput into two principal subcategories. The portion of the energy throughput which the process itself must appear to consume to avoid running down is termed the energy of the system. The term running down was brought into usage by Isaac Newton at the discussion of Newton's point in the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, which was that the image employed is the running down of the mainspring of a simple mechanical timepiece. This is the historical root of the definition of entropy in ordinary mechanics. The energy of the system is considered to include the loss of power to accomplish work associated with friction, waste heat, and so forth. If any portion of the energy throughput remains after the deduction of required energy of the system, the remaining portion is named free energy. Let us imagine, for purposes of initial approximation, that economic processes are the form of the self-contained consolidated agro-industrial enterprise described earlier in this text. The kind of thermodynamic process we must imagine to examine the consolidated agro-industrial enterprise thermodynamically is a closed thermodynamic process. All of the sources and applications of energy are contained within the process examined. In such a case, the energy of the system corresponds to the costs and expenses of producing the total physical goods and related output, and the free energy is the net operating profit of the enterprise as a whole. The mathematical functions required are obtained by examining the effects of the reinvestment of the free energy, the net operating profit, as added energy of the system. The characteristic effect selected as measure of the performance of this mathematical function is economy of labor, as this was defined in earlier portions of this text. The apparent effect of reinvestment of free energy to increase the energy of the system is to increase the costs of the economy per capita, which might appear to be directly opposite to the result required. In a successful economy, it appears that a directly opposite net result occurs. The social costs of producing a constant content market basket are reduced. That's economy of labor. To uncover the fallacy embedded within such a paradox, we are led to recognize that there is a mixing of apples and oranges in our counting procedure. Yes, the energy of the system does increase, but the cost of supplying this energy as cost of labor is reduced. There is an increase of the energy cost of the per capita activities of labor, but the labor cost of producing this energy is reduced, sufficient to lower the average cost of per capita labor. This is the result corresponding to the characteristic effect selected for defining our mathematical function. We now restate this paradox in terms of changes of value of the ratio of free energy to energy of the system. If the quantity of energy throughput were constant over successive cycles of a thermodynamically described economic process, then the increase of per capita energy of the system by converting reinvested free energy into added energy of the system must cause the ratio of free energy to energy of the system to fall. Then, as the mathematical function, the economic process, were extended over time, the ratio must converge upon zero. If we include the effects of depletion of natural resources within the closed thermodynamic system, the ratio must become negative over time. The economic or thermodynamic process must collapse. In the case of the closed thermodynamic process, the fact that the ratio of free energy to energy of the system falls in such a fashion signifies that the process corresponding to such a mathematical function is characteristically entropic. The mainspring is winding down. Taking human existence as a whole, the increase of potential relative population density proves that the desired anti-entropic result actually exists in economic processes. Increase of the potential relative population density corresponds to a mathematical function characterized by negative entropy or negativity. This is also the characteristic of living processes, including the existence of the human species. If we accept the implicit assumptions of the caloric theory of heat, the fact that human existence is negentropic implies that society's continued existence requires mankind to draw down the energy supplies of our environment. This is one among the rationalizations employed by the neo-Malthusian Club of Rome and its sympathizers. Yes, the better informed among such circles argue, perhaps living systems and perhaps even successful economies have been negentropic until the present time. The problem is, they say, that we are drawing down the finite supplies of energy from our environment at such a rate that we cannot continue to proceed negentropic.
So just to point that out, this is a negentropic reflection of a negentropic growth, and obviously as it's collapsing and running down, that's what he's referring to as well, just the growth is negentropic. It's against entropy. It's running up. It's not running down. Or you're causing your investments to drive it to higher and higher levels.
So entropy means?
Entropy is when it's winding down. You're actually using up your ability. You're killing off your population. In some cases, these guys even say you have to kill off the population to stop this. I go back to the next, what's that? Yeah, this one. Can people see that?
Yeah.
What they're basically saying is you've got a rate of population growth that's exponential, and your ability to produce food falls below that. Or if you can reverse it a little bit, if you have your use of various raw materials being used up faster and faster, and your population is growing, you're going to reach crisis points where you have a breakdown crisis. And the British Empire, for example, is always at these kinds of points before it gets to that point, orchestrate a war, even a global war, and reorganize the paper so they still stay on top, which is really what they're attempting to do today. Up to the point that Mike just read, in 1972, this Limits to Growth book came out, basically relating this with the next portion he'll read. Actually, when Lynn put out our book, No Limits to Growth, his book, they corresponded, coming back and attempted to add various kinds of other dynamics involved in that, but basically on the same assumption that there is no creative mentation, a creative intervention by human beings. So, like in this, once they start their graphs, all progress and notions of progress and development, and they just have their computer models that reflect a fixed collapsing situation. And so they just added a lot more components to prove their point. They're all measured in the same linear form.
What kind of components did they add?
Well, they measure different kinds of things like, can't read it from here. Mike, can you read the bigger on there?
Well, you can't really read it. It's not that big.
Did you say mosquitoes?
Casinos.
Oh, casinos.
Well, food per capita is purple there.
Uh-huh.
Births is the red line.
What is it?
Births.
Births. Uh-huh.
Industrial output per capita is the
green one?
the sort of, well, the one that's sort of green, yeah, but
The one that
the
falls
one-
precipitously?
right, the one that falls not precipitously.
Yeah.
Right. Well, the one that falls the most precipitously is resources,
Oh, yeah.
available resources.
Okay. Is that the
Right,
red
yeah,
one?
Similar things like that. It's all this hocus pocus.
So yeah, why don't you start just where it says the arguments of the writer. What page is this? You're on page 45. Bottom paragraph.
The arguments of the writer and his associates to this effect prompted the leading neo-Malthusians, including leading policymakers for the Club of Rome, to alter the appearance of their argument. That's what he's talking about there. The writers widely circulated published work on the subject of increase of potential relative population density embarrassed the policymakers of the Club of Rome to the effect that they shifted away from the Meadows-Forrester doctrine of limits to growth to a simple parody of the 18th century physiocrats. They insisted that the carrying capacity of habitable land was being exceeded at present levels of population. They argued simply that the universe as a whole is governed by a law of entropy, and that man's continued existence was accelerating the rate at which the universe is being urged to its inevitable rotodamron of heat death. In other words, man's attempt to maintain present levels of population or increase them by means of technological progress is accelerating the rate at which mankind draws down the finite energy supplies of his environment. Mankind is already at or past the threshold of consuming energy at a higher rate than the environment supplies.
Okay, and then just two other short paragraphs on the next page, 47, starting with implicity. It lays out the other side.
Implicitly, the second law of thermodynamics was conclusively refuted by the works of Johannes Kepler, published at the beginning of the 17th century, 2 centuries before Cauchy's incumbency was imposed upon the École Polytechnique by the 1815 Congress of Vienna. Some of the points bearing upon this have been identified earlier in this text. Now we identify the bearing of that material on Kepler's proof. We noted that Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci had been the first moderns to report that living processes are distinguished from non-living by self-similar growth, congruent with the golden section. Kepler later re-emphasized the same distinction. The crucial fact bearing upon the second law of thermodynamics is that all of Kepler's laws of astronomy were derived by a construction premised on the starting point of the golden section. Since it was later shown by Gauss that Kepler's laws were uniquely appropriate, and since these laws are subsumed by the golden section, the universe as a whole has the same characteristic as living processes. The universe as a whole is characteristically megatropic.
Again, that the entire universe is growing and developing in higher forms of complexity and energy. And so I wanted to stop that section there. If you, as Keisha also referenced earlier, this LaRouche-Riemannian measurement of economy, if you go back to the 80s and you look at Mr. LaRouche's forecast then, as you can do today in terms of what we just said, the accuracy in terms of what was actually going on and what happened and the relation of his forecast to that, or corresponding almost identical graphs when you have all these other kind of economic models, you know, being totally wrong, pointing things in the wrong direction, at least the gaps in terms of diversion from the accuracy is quite significant. So what I wanted to do, if people don't have any questions on this, is actually begin a discussion on the measurement, because if anybody looked through the chapter itself and you see these cones and spirals and the cuts, and especially then if you get into looking at what those cuts represent mathematically, it really becomes quite challenging and almost even scary.
Okay.
And last week we talked a little bit about circular action and least action, and we looked a little bit at tool design in terms of how the most efficient replication of those self-similar actions, especially circular action, we can deliver the most power or effect for the amount of work you do. And there was a, if you look just at, if you look at any figure for a particular length, parameter or perimeter, what is in the maximum minimum relationship to it? What's the maximum area you can get with that perimeter? And there's various kinds of quick things you can look at that if you obviously flip this the other way, well, that would keep the same perimeter, but it would increase the area, right? Same thing here, if you did, people understand what I just did?
Yeah.
You have an area in here, but if you do the same thing here, and flip that, or here. So on the first approximation, your biggest area per perimeter is obviously going to be not concave in any form, it's going to be a convex, all right? And that'll get, more and more subtle as you get closer and closer, to a circle. So you can come at that. It's called the isoparametric principle. And if you then look at that circle, well, anyway, we got one. Yeah. You have an efficiency in that circle, whether you're talking about, eventually developing machines and whatever. But it's not just a circle as a design, it's actually what Leibniz refers to and Lynn in his work. Okay. What Leibniz and then Lynn also goes through is the circular action. If you take, for example, if you start with squares in here, and you have those sides each time. So you go from like a 4-sided figure to an 8-sided figure to a 16-sided figure to a 32-sided figure. You can see it becomes, you get up to like 144 sides. It becomes closer and closer to a circle, but it never becomes a circle because you obviously have a polygon that's got more and more sides, and a circle has no sides, right? So there's an ontological, a difference in being, a difference in actual, the way something exists. It's ontologically, the circle is a higher order than the polygons. And the reason I'm saying that is this kind of transfinite governing of a system is really what becomes just more and more complex as you get into defining these various kinds of measurements. I think in the first discussion, Keisha had laid out that, well, also I put it into the introduction that was on the email. Most schools and most people think when they talk about space and time, it's a three-dimensional situation. It goes forward and backward, it goes up and down, it comes toward you in a way. You have kind of a fixed grid, and it has activity only in those directions. And it has, time comes in, and it functions in a one direction, also forward and backward. So you have a dynamic which is imposed on the universe, which you then consider that it's filled up with all kinds of unique singular dots, or connection of two dots give you a line. And what's interesting about that kind of conception of the universe and space and time is it drops out everything we started talking about earlier today. It drops out any kind of notion of causality, including why it's there in the first place. So what Keisha touched on the first meeting is she took a circle, in terms of trying to figure out where do these dots come from, what give them any kind of existence. Well, she took that circle and she folded it in half. She folded it on itself, which is like self-reflexive. And when you fold that on yourself, like we folded it here down to here, well, then that action created a singularity called the diameter, a line. So the line doesn't exist as something in and of itself. It exists as a boundary condition of a certain action you did. And then she folded it again on itself, and then you have it folding this way, so you end up getting a central point. And so the point is a creation, a reflection of an action, and it creates another singularity. And so two things here. One, you've got a study of action and processes that are the primary measure, not kind of an arbitrarily fixed kind of notion that Greenspan has with money. That's the economy. What's the real economy is the functions of the dynamics we apply. So I just wanted to do this because it gives you a concept of a higher ordered process governing a lower order process. Obviously, the real component in society and in the universe today, as much as we've got going on out here in terms of the universe, the governing highest level of ordering process is the human mind's ability to read those processes effectively and actually affect them. So Okay, why don't you do the next one? I think it's the sunlight. Now, circles and things seem to exist somewhat on their own or mentally, but you take this particular dynamic, it's called a cycloid, and can people kind of guess what it represents? For example, if you take your tire on your car and point to the spot that has the air valve, all right? Now, as your tire rolls down the street, that valve, doesn't travel in a linear kind of manner. It actually travels around the tire as you're moving, right? So, say here it is. As this now rolls across this will actually follow a path which gives you this arc. So it's not an algebraic or a mathematical curve. It's actually a physically generated curve. Now, it has some interesting characteristics. That the actual volume is 3 circles, and you can go through a lot of that.
Does that mean like 3 rotations of the tire? Or
This is 1 rotation at a time.
1 rotation of the tire.
It's going from this point, the points here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's rolling here. So here you'd have, the tire would be over here again right now.
Okay.
Right. So the point is back to the point where it started on this next the tire is rolling here. It's halfway. Well, it's coming on the right. I guess this is only a half, right?
Because it would wind up down at the street.
Right, it'd be a full time.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is a half of the cycloid. What's interesting about this particular curve, if Mike goes to the next slide, it actually has a number of different characteristics. One of which is ichronicity, which means that every portion of the curve, for example, and this is here a straight shot. If you put a marble or a ball here and here at the same time, it's a least action curve. The ball will get to the center here before this particular ball coming down here gets there. It's actually the fastest path. And you can go on the internet and you can see some descriptions of this. Not only is it the fastest path of any curve, you can try parabolas, you can try a circle, but this particular curve, the cycloid, is the least action curve, even faster than a straight line. And this is governed, like I was saying, by these higher principles of ordering. Now, if you put a particular ball here and one here, and you release them at the same time, they would both get there at the same time. We still have that track.
We used to have one, but Brian took it. We'll have to bring it next time.
Okay.
We have that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it has a number of interesting functions.
Where are you saying you put it? Where could we?
Well, you could start it anywhere. If you put one ball here and one right here, no matter where you start your swing, they're isochronistic. They end here at the same time.
Yeah, you can start the ball at the top of the straight line and near the bottom of it, and you're still.
The nature of the curve will get them simultaneously there.
I mean on the iso.
Yeah, on the track itself. This
On
is
the
Yeah.
cycle
cycle.
itself, yeah.
This is just put in to show that it's even faster than a straight line.
Right.
But anywhere on that curve.
Anywhere. Now, what's interesting is one of the things they built out of this, since any swing here takes up the same time each time it swings, the time involved is unchanging. If you flip this over and you create well, actually, if you did it, so that you use what's basically the tracks. Here we have the curve coming 2 ways to a point.
Yeah.
You can actually hang a pendulum that picks up and references that curve, so no matter how slow it gets, it would be the same time. So they actually built clocks off of these kinds of things, especially, for example, at sea, where you built them in the round where the movement of the ships wouldn't affect its timing.
Until you start swinging that pendulum in space, then I said until you start swinging that pendulum.
Orbit.
Yeah. While you said while in orbit, right?
Right, because you're in space.
We're in space. But you're saying
in outer space.
You're saying it's a different law when you go into outer space.
Uh-huh.
Well, microgravity.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's an interesting idea.
Okay, any questions on this? What interesting thing is that these higher functions are governing the curvature. It's not a mathematical curvature that you kind of in a linear form created. Here's another example. If you take a chain and you hang it up, if it's a equally spaced linked chain, it'll hang in a manner so that the weight is distributed equally. If you take this one out, you put a pin in here and took this one out, it would still hang the same way. Again, it's defined by it's a physical curve as opposed to you get into various designs like the Arch in St. Louis or the Arch, or you get the Brunelleschi dome that was basically built. They were able to construct the dome by taking advantage of the fact that it supports itself. Anyway, these are two examples of curves that, like we said with the circle, defining the polygons, these curves are defined by these higher orders. In fact, go back to the one previous to this. Everybody has seen, for example, you go to a creek or something, or a lake, and you stick a stick into the water. The reflection of the light bends when in the portion that's in the water, right? If you actually had a series where you have air and then you have water, but if you had a series of different weights of oil, for example, so you could finely tune the density of what you're sticking your stick into, the curvature of that stick in the water that has just like a bend that you see would actually be this curvature. So you begin to look, so how does the light know to reflect these kinds of these actions? You see there's dynamics built into the way the universe physically functions that we've had a series of breakthroughs like Huygens, all these guys who figured out these things. And so like I was saying earlier, if you wrote the mathematics of this, it becomes so complex, people get scared away, but the physical ideas are really quite understandable. And it's these kinds of measurements on these physical processes of multi-leveled dynamics, like in an economic system, that Mr. LaRouche applied to measuring the dynamics in the economy itself. And, so I think this is a slide after this. Another example, if you take a square and you add a side to it, double the square, and then you double that, and then you double that, or you add a square to that, you get this kind of a self-similar spiral, which is reflected all through living nature. This is the self-similar spiral and kind of action that was mentioned in some of the reading. This is, if you look at various kinds of, series of animals and whatever, you have, a couple, at the rate of offspring, it actually follows a similar kind of self-similar spiral of genetic development. So you look at, seashells, you can look at some of the spiral galaxies, you can go through a lot of different things. Anyway, it's another example of a curvature that is beyond these kind of linear projections that people design to reflect a particular functions that you're going to achieve. We can go to the next one. I don't want to give anybody have any discussions as we go. And then this is, I wanted to just put in there because we're not going to get into the iconic sections this week. But if you look at various kinds of things, this is like a full cone, top and bottom. You know, it's what people know as a cone. But the various kinds of things you've seen all through mathematics, if you make these various cuts, you know, you cut it up here in this portion of the cone, you get a parabola. If you cut it at an angle, so you hit this one and this one, you get the hyperbolic curves. You cut it this way, you get a circle. And again, the mathematics of all this really gets quite complicated, but it merely expresses a concept that's easily gotten by people. So again, what all these measurements of different kind of dynamics of different multiple manifolds, Gauss and Riemann and all these people get into. Lyndon LaRouche, though, is actually applying that to measuring physical economy. These subtle changes that take place when you put a new technology in, or where you credit or do not credit. But he's got a physical mathematics that corresponds to that. It's governed by the physics and the real functions of development, as opposed to a mathematical model. You hear all these guys that are putting in these computer models to make money on a gambling operation, and it really has nothing to do with the economy. It's various kinds of, mathematicians playing tricks and being able to have a system to gamble and read forecasts, but it's all in a money system. It means nothing. And then what we were saying, if you strictly went through time, you have a circle here that's going through time, for example, there's really no work being done. It's a circle that's staying the same size and the same volume. The use of a self-reflective cone, as you come up, obviously it's getting bigger and bigger. So it's one of the things that LaRouche uses to measure, like we said, the relative population potential, the density of that relative potential population density. From one cycle, as this thing goes up to the next, what is the increase and how do you measure that? And so you have a self-similar growth that can be measured in real terms and real accounting in that sense, but it's reflecting a physical reality as opposed to just paper. Go.
I want to go back.
Sure.
Because I think to go back more so to that, to this question of cause and reason and non-linearity. I think that's a very perfect example as you're developing about the whole question of causality in the universe, or the fact that there's, but what is it that's characterizing or causing that shape to be a least action pathway in principle. And so I think that's just kind of going back and playing around with some of that a little bit to, because you can see it there, but it's always fun. I don't have an actual chain to, to show, like, okay, I forgot my gold chain, but I'm holding a piece of string in my hand. I'm holding a long string in my hand that, it's the same characteristic. Unfortunately, no one that hold it more than hands. So we'll pretend this is a chain. So as Ron was saying, you look at the, why does it actually hang as when your necklace hangs on your, there you go. She's got one that looks much better because I have to.
It works better if it's gold.
She gave me a gold one too. See? And then she'll hold. Okay. So if, as Ron just did, we just took a few of the links from the chain and did the curvature of the chain actually change? Did it lose? So go back to the way we had it. Sorry. Okay, and so he takes a few links from the chain, and that I can even take a few links from this side. You look at, you see a change in the curvature. Okay, well, let's do it again. This side again. You see a change in the curvature. Side again.
But as soon as you move either the sides, it'll affect everything at once.
Yeah, you have to keep it the same height if they're gonna be the same curve.
Right.
And how does that apply, would you say, to Lynn's economics? In other words, that's what you're
He's trying to, I think he's trying to get at non-linearity, you know, in the economy. That, you know, to shake up the ideas that you have about how the universe works. Because if you accept this linear outlook of how, you know, these fools that think it's about money, you know, tell you, you know, that you know, food production works linearly and population growth is nonlinear, you know, that we're going to run out of food and can't support greater populations. You know, you look at these laws that actually apply universally, you know, then you have a whole different sense of the universe. Is that correct? Is that what
If you're in the
It's a-
entire house,
Mhm.
and you want to cross this mountain path, you have a hanging rope.
What was that, Joe?
They,
The hanging rope bridge, the footbridges, they're hanging ropes.
they're catenaries, so they're hanging chains. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Like in real economy, physical economy, when you're building things, I think you had something you were going through. But
Bridge.
a bridge, yeah, a suspension bridge, all these things that are collapsing right now because they haven't been refurbished and so forth, or built up in many years. How did they actually, what physical mechanism did they use to build those? They didn't just draw a bunch of straight lines and build a bridge. There was a principle in which that bridge was formed. And if you go, and there's a lot of places around the country where you'll see bridges that actually have this characteristic and shape, called a suspension. Yes,
Yeah.
bridge, suspension, and other.
Because you know, Leibniz uses animals to figure out.
Thank you. And say it again. Leibniz uses animals.
Yeah, again, that is the canary.
Cat that ate the canary.
And form the catenary.
Catenary. Thank you.
Joe, you know you're being, you're live, Joe. The whole world is going to see.
He definitely is live.
Yeah, Joe.
But I think, Marcia, to answer your question, I think if this is where if you look at the chapters, and I went through some of it, immediately it gets a little overwhelming because you see these Gaussian kind of n plus, you know, various kinds of, Riemannian fields and whatever. And really they're just reflections of different singularities and multiple singularities. And what these guys developed were various ways you could measure that. And those same kind of physical dynamics are involved when you're determining the technologies and the kind of dynamics that the technologies are going to affect. So I think especially, it'll change somewhat when we get into space and some of that. But I think what I wanted to get with this is that, or get at this question is what Lynn is measuring in the economy, as the portion that Mike read, he discussed how when you have an energy in a system, and part of it is used to maintain the system, that's the energy of the system. And then you have a surplus if you're producing something that's and you then reinvest that surplus, that free energy back into the system, he says there's an immediate dichotomy that sets up as now you're having the system take more energy than it did before. So isn't that exactly the opposite of what you want to have done? And he makes the point that you resolve that because you're actually investing your free energy into the ability of your labor force to do it with less effort and less energy. So the application of a new technology, for example, allows you to do that. So there's all kinds of subtleties like this, not just, how different things and stress go on the new technology you're doing, but I think in the discussion of the economy itself and what's involved in it, there's dynamics in that these same functions as a mathematical measure can be used to measure. And when we talk about Lynn's Riemannian, LaRouche-Riemannian, he used Cantor's mathematics and then Riemann to actually develop a system that allows you to measure that causality, as opposed to just in a linear form. You can say it's bigger, or there's all other kinds of dynamics involved in that aren't measured just by dimensions or even by heat.
Yeah, the thing that the Malthusians don't include is this leap that takes place. That it's between coal and petroleum, between petroleum and fission. It's not in their mathematics.
Yeah. In fact, it doesn't exist in the previous mathematics. It's one of the reasons why when we had that one with the polygons getting closer and closer and closer to the circle, it's never going to get there because the circle is actually a higher order. And so there's no way you can inch your way up to a breakthrough on thermonuclear fusion. We're going to actually use everything we've got now to sustain an economy to create the conditions where you can get that kind of a breakthrough. The breakthrough is going to be something totally new, and it'll probably simplify everything we understand before that. But there's no linear form that you can get that. It's also again, going back to the example of what's the parallel between our discussion of economy and politics and the culture, right? But where do the new technologies come from? Where do the new insights come from? It comes from a playful, creative population. It comes from having created a situation where you have, like in China, look at the number of people involved in classical music, and especially the youth, right? And so it's not a surprise that you also have this kind of breakout that can be directed, right? Right now we have a major problem in the United States. If we adopted these policies tomorrow and said, let's start building the magnetically elevated trains, look at the workforce, look at the young people, look at the level of skilled labor we have, also the plant and equipment, and the population's ability to pick that up quickly and run with it. We've lost a lot since we put the man on the moon under Kennedy's initiative. So there's, again, if the economy is looked at as a physical economy and a creative application of man solving these problems that take us in this negentropic order up, well, then you have to have a population, not just everybody making those breakthroughs, but look at the medical force you need, the educational force, the infrastructure force. Look at the increase of skilled labor you have to have at every level. And so I think it measures some of those kinds of things, those kinds of changes, where you can't really do it with a simple mathematics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you think about what FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, did with the civilian conservation or the CCC work programs, going back to this whole question of the cultural dynamic and process that was unfolding there too, that you couldn't just take a bunch of people and just throw them into factories and put it to work. You actually had to do extensive training classes. These young people were being put into work educational programs where they would go through so many hours of training and classes and then go and apply it, do application in the field. And then you would also have a very high promotion of the arts, culture, music, spirituals. He had a program where he was very much developing the African American spirituals with Marian Anderson and others, and then also classical arts and music as well. And it's interesting is that was one of the key things that was attacked by the cultural opposition groups, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and groups that were later named that, because they knew that if you had a population that could be playful and creative in the way that you were just describing, because you just train people to be workhorses and to just be out there and to be able to go and do a specific job versus how to increase the productivity of that job, they have to be happy. And that's interesting because there's at the beginning of LaRouche's book here, he mentions the first economic writing. It's a very short writing by Gottfried Leibniz called Society and Economy. And he's actually talking about that, like if you're going to have better productive working society, you have to make your population happier. And then he goes through methods of how you actually transform the work environment to be able to do that, where people aren't like being, they're not being sluggish or banal, or they're not going home and wanting to drink every day because they work themselves to death, and then they're working their body into horrible physical conditions doing manual labor that's killing them, and then they want to go home and they don't want to do anything productive, that they want to just, they have bad family relations because they're not playful, their children are affected by it, the world's just affected by it, society, so on and so forth. So, but then how do you actually create the conditions where the work environment is better, producing better, social, better family, and home environment, and you just transform the economic conditions of society all the way around.
Yes, I was just thinking while Keisha was talking, a good example of how do you measure the particular dynamics going on from these higher orders is the Chinese adopted a version of this kind of policy, as we see they're building all around the world, these infrastructure projects, creating these conditions. They're obviously paralleled by the Russians, and they're moving to stabilize regions like the Middle East and terrorism. Now, we just had a shift in the United States that took the British-run Obama out of the picture, and although President Trump hasn't adopted all this yet, the potential of him as a maverick taking up the Japanese offer to invest, or taking up the Chinese offer to invest, and you see the dynamics going on by this other moneyed crowd, the empire crowd, to deploy everything in the media, in their political structure that controls the various things to break that up. So you can't, if you watch the media, how would you figure that out? Trying to measure it from parties, or trying to measure it from what just happened or what will happen. But if you understand this bigger fight that's going on between the two systems, one, a physical economy, more and more having the political upper hand. Now, what if the United States and Europe joins that? So you have a Russia, China, and the United States. What happens to that mountain of derivative debt as the world adopts Glass-Steagall and just says it's your gambling debt? We don't recognize it as a debt that's legitimate. We're writing it off. And they can scream all they want that you're all going to go under. And it's not true, because if we have a credit system like Lincoln with the greenback policy or Roosevelt policy that's investing in these kinds of things in parallel with the other nations, well, then we happily put all this to work. And so again, it's the human intervention, in this case also political, that's going to pull that off. And that's the fight that's going on in everybody's life each day we live. And what LaRouche has done with his insight for the last 40 years is define that in a form that is now not only understandable at more and more levels, but it's been politically accepted. People have been willing to buck these bigger operations. You see that even in relatively small countries that are signing on with the other dynamics. But it's these higher curvatures that define how you measure it, or if you get an accurate measure.
I was thinking about Ecuador, you know, it's a relatively small country that not only is working with the Chinese and building infrastructure in their country, but they've also politically taken in, you know, this character into their embassy in London.
Julian Assange.
Right? They're, you know, it works together.
And many of these countries beginning to build science cities. Look at the Chinese and their investment.
Exactly.
It's, and so you see, I don't know if everybody was at the event Thursday night, you see the quality of the audience change in the course of the event. It happened right in front of people's faces. You know? Not just optimism and happy, but really the manner in which people think and what they look to be a measurement.
I think, because you weren't able to be there, it's worth just telling you that, I mean, you can even see this in the speakers, you know, from the Chinese government, the Egyptian government, the moderator, who is originally from Trinidad, he's a professor. And so they each had their presentations, and of course Brian did an excellent presentation, but then they had a dialogue at the table, and so the presentations were given, but they were in a dialogue, and that was very interesting. And then the audience questions. I think what happened is that the speakers recognized that there was a tremendous receptivity to this idea of a dialogue of civilization. And I think we all saw, you know, everybody was uplifted by this dialogue process, which was only supposed to go till 8:30. I think it finally cut off at 9:30, only because they had to get us out of there. But it really, I think we were all, those of us that were there, had the privilege of seeing something where this process is really becoming unleashed. And, you know, I think everybody there, you know, will have various ways we're going to express this to others, because as the Egyptian member of the consulate said at the end, it's up to you. This is not about government to government now. This is people to people. We have to relate to each other around these ideas to, you know, get across to each other, to our fellow members of our society, that, look, this method works. LaRouche has a scientific method. It's been proven in China. And now countries are working together like China and Egypt, and it's blossoming. So I think that's, you know, we really have a great advantage now, having seen this right here in Houston, in this small meeting relatively. But this is the kind of work we're doing all over the country and internationally, as Keisha was starting with the Denmark concert that we had.
Yeah, I think when a person realizes what's actually possible after being in this prison cell where, you know, we're told nothing is possible, you know, shut up, sit down, and, you know, cut back, right? You know, that's what changes the mind.
Yeah.
You know, you see, you get out of prison.
And then you want to help others get out of prison.
Yeah, that's right.
It's infectious.
It's like everybody involved,
Yes,
government and people.
to the people, right, exactly. And yeah, I think that the speakers got as excited as the audience, you know, because they realize that people are hungry for this. You know, they want this. Yeah.
So win-win.
Win-win-win, yeah.
Did you have any discussion about it afterwards, or thoughts?
Well, no, not really. I was able to take in, you know, everything that went on there, and it's kind of, I have to do a lot of reading too in the books that they're on the table. So what, and you have a real understanding about what's actually going on.
The Berlin report?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we have, as an organization, under Mr. LaRouche's direction, there are a lot of classes and videos on our site on these subjects. People can jump into reading chapter 3. Next week we'll continue it, and we'll go through a little bit more of, I think, some of these conic section measurements. And what I wanted to do tonight is just get a little bit of the language so that doesn't scare people, because it's really the concepts. Because some of the things that people got scared of in terms of going to school in mathematics, irrational numbers, or these square root of -1 and this kind of stuff. And really, if you think it's only a matter of designing something that allows you to mathematically construct curvature. So if you go around that the cylinder or the conic, it's just a language that allows you to express that. Conceptually, it's not that difficult, and we can walk people through that. So, and then it just says here toward the end, I was going to have Mike read the last page here. It says,
Wait a second. What page?
It's on page 61. It says, much of this has proven to have direct bearing on the principal issues internal to economic science, and how could it be otherwise, since the central subject matter of economic science is technology, this creation of new technology, which is also. And then, Mike, you want to just read that summary now?
To summarize the immediately foregoing review of the special features of mathematical physics bearing directly upon economic science. Number 1, the real universe as a whole is negatropic, as is shown by critical scrutiny of Kepler's laws of astronomy and by Gauss. 2, the real universe lies ontologically in the continuous manifold, a manifold mathematically explored by synthetic geometry based on self-similar conical spiral action. The visible world is a distorted projected image of the real world. 3, the kind of number which corresponds immediately to the reality of the physical world is of the form of complex numbers. Complex numbers generated by synthetic geometric construction in the continuous manifold, the complex domain. The counting numbers are the projections of complex numbers into the visible world. Knowledge of the physical world, therefore, knowledge of the physical world is derived from what Riemann defines as unique experiments. Hence, the so-called laws of thermodynamics are false to physical reality and are arbitrary postulates superimposed from the exterior upon scientific work. Most emphatically, any thermodynamics which requires these 3 putative laws is entropic, a condition contrary to the proven fundamental ordering of the universe. Also, energy and work, properly defined, correspond to realities existing within the continuous manifold, corresponding to complex functions, not reducible to simple scalar magnitudes. Energy and work are not things. They are processes.
Can you put the cone and the spiral up on the top? I mean the cylinder. One before this one. Yeah, this one. I mean, we'll go into some of this next week, but if you, for example, if you take a cut across here, you'll get an ellipse, like the kind of ellipse that planets are ordered in. And then if you do, like, if you project this down, obviously you get a circle, like we have here. But the cone will also do it. But if you project down this elliptical cut, you get an ellipse down here. It sticks out this far, obviously, from the end of the ellipse over here, and the other end will be here. This is actually at one of the foci in that ellipse, and it becomes an ability as you measure this circular action on the ellipse. It actually reflects the kind of circular action or elliptical action of a planet going around the sun. So again, these are the kinds of devices that were invented and developed to measure the physical operations that were discovered, like with especially with Kepler and others, that people developed that, or Gauss being able to project where the orbit of Ceres would reemerge. So this, again, it looks difficult, but like I said earlier, if you look at everybody was sort of negative, minus I and all this kind of, or I. It's just a measurement around the circle that's expressed mathematically. So conceptually, it's not that difficult. And we'll go through a little bit that much. I just wanted to lay the basis of some. Ryan and I and Keisha will work through it. It'll be the next part of this particular chapter rather than getting into all of this.
But it's not just that. It's if you look at what hidden figures, she goes from the elliptical orbit of the spacecraft, changes it to a
Huh. I'm sorry, say again? She goes through?
She figures out the elliptical orbit of John Glenn's spacecraft.
Right.
If you're gonna change it, you have to change the foci. You have to do foci of the ellipse. If you move one of the foci to infinity, with reverse thrusters, you can change it from an ellipse to a parabola, so that you can calculate. And you just have landing area.
Uh-huh. Huh. And was that from her?
No, the
boiler?
Cohen's.
That's what I think it's with the boiler transfer.
Oh, that's interesting. I wondered.
Yeah, it's Euler, it's
See, right
Euler.
here through at an angle is the ellipse. If you shift the foci so you're cutting it in a different manner, you get what Joe was talking about, a parabola.
Huh.
And so you have different measurements and different dynamics and all.
Right, instead of going out like a comet,
Right.
you can flip it to like a ballistic missile.
Returning to Earth.
Return.
Yeah.
See, there you go. That's important because
You gotta know where to send the ships.
you gotta know where to send the ships. You gotta know where to send the spacecraft so it won't be landed in the wrong place or crashing into a mountain or something instead of landing where it's supposed to be landed. So you talking about physical.
But the British didn't use that, so their missile was heading towards.
The wrong direction.
Which missile was that?
Tried it.
Remember?
Oh, the one that was supposed to.
It was supposed to go west.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The Russian? You said the Russian?
No,
the
British.
The British. That's what I thought. Yeah. Or
Just a
Central.
couple weeks ago.
British.
But if you think of the importance of, bringing people back or, in terms of, you have to know this scientifically, that's how Lynn looks at the economy. You have to actually know what you're doing. Again, like we said earlier, 50 years down the road, what's your potential? What do you have to create? And that's how Hamilton looked at the economy. What was the credit system of Hamilton? Is where do you have to put the credit line, like the blood system, to keep the whole system functioning and being and developing? So it's not a simple process, but it's an understandable process. It's just that, like Keisha said in the first class, and I mentioned here tonight, you have a notion that space just extends this way and this way and this way, and then time, goes forward and backwards. Some people think actually they could go. You have these magical notions that people think they can move through time in that kind of form. But it's an imposition on the universe, preconceived. We're taught that kind of linearity as opposed to how do you get kids to work through all these fundamental breakthroughs in school so they come out of grade school and then out of high school having mastered 60 of these fundamental breakthroughs of people from the past. So it's not that they can answer it on the test. They actually come out standing on the history of the culture, whatever culture it is, the Chinese culture, the African culture, the European, Italian Renaissance. Yes. But you have universal minds that are part of their own culture and part of humanity that then specialize from there. Right?
Because they've actually they've made the discovery in their own mind.
Yeah.
Recreated. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And 2 or 3 discoveries into the system when they figure out, or their little group that's doing it figures it out, well, they're going to begin realizing that they have a mind like the guy that figured it out. Right?
It was interesting the way they answered that question about, well, how do you tell the truth on the internet? If you don't know how to figure out whether Kepler was correct, then you have no basis of figuring out what the truth is. So you believe it.
And that's why Lynn had the youth doubling the square, moving towards doubling the cube. Because once they knew they could do that, then they could trust their mind.
You could understand
what
it.
you need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think music has a similar impact. If people can follow a fugue, I mean, that takes tremendous, play a fugue, but following it, even just listening. I used to try and introduce people to classical music by playing the Goldberg variations. Because what you would hear, you'd hear the theme, and then it would start changing. And once you have that, you're able to then begin to hear different voices. And so you're able to then hold a lot in your mind at one time, and it's quite a thrill, right? I think it gives people that same kind of sense of competency.
And then you get to the reflection of this guy who's writing the book on Lynn, just surprised by the sheer number of
areas like that.
fugues he's holding in his mind.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah, and then to realize that has a relationship to this self-similar growth process. Geometry as well.
Yeah.
It's not just like music,
Magic,
whatever form, whatever rule. You like geometry, there are rules. It's not just like whatever you want to make it.
Whatever makes you feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like those famous Beatles.
I was saying earlier on the site, there's Jason Ross has done a lot on this. There are various discussions in the past. This is a journal we put out on cold fusion. There's whole sections in here. I mean, one thing about this report, it's got more footnotes than text. In terms of, it's really like a class. You can just kind of work your way through. And, it's a bit overwhelming. Like looking at the chapter can be a little overwhelming. You keep it at the conceptual level, and the mathematics is secondary to understanding these notions of process and development.
Well, you're giving footnotes, just to add one, which I think we should also put on the description of the class series, continue to put it, that this book, so you wish to learn all about economics, Lyndon LaRouche wrote, he also did himself a video production, going through a detailed class describing his own method and thinking called The Power of Labor. And I really encourage people to watch that video as you go through and read this book and material, so that, as we continue to have these discussions, you'll be provoked by the dialogue here, but then also by the direct thinking process that LaRouche unfolds. So if you want to find it, which I said we'll put the link up on the in the description of the YouTube channel that we're showing this on. It's on LaRouchePAC.com, and it's called On LaRouche's Discovery. And it's the first,
You just type that in?
LaRouchePAC.com, and then well, the steps are that you go, once you get to the website, you go to the About tab at the top, and once you click on the About tab, it's at the very bottom of that tab. It's called on LaRouche's discovery. You click on that, and then that'll be the first thing I believe that will come up. But I think we can put a link that will make it easier to just get straight directly to it. Yeah, it's about a 2-hour video. It goes through the principles laid out in pretty much in the entire book. And then fun, very, very fun to see Mr. LaRouche going through. He was doing these economics classes all over the country, all over the world, in Russia.
He was younger than me.
Yeah. I think this book has also been transcribed into, translated rather, into many languages. Chinese, Russian,
Spanish.
Spanish, maybe others.
How much of it?
I don't know if it's Arabic or not, but maybe.
There's a very interesting story about that, because when Lyndon LaRouche was sent to prison by George Sr., when Lyndon LaRouche was sent to prison by George Bush Sr., there was a project that got kicked off in Russia and various parts of the Soviet Union. They translated every book they could find by Lynn. And after some group of scientists had read everything they could find, they said, I've got more questions. I've got more questions. Where is this guy? And he was sitting in a damn jail cell in the United States. And so they made their way to that jail cell, to find the answer to their questions that he had provoked in them. And when he got out finally, they welcomed him into their group of 100 top scientists, in the Soviet Union.
Well, it was Russian by then.
Yeah, by that time, right. Yeah. But anyway, Lynn's got a relationship to the Russians too, okay?
Uh-oh.
It's totally kosher.
No. Russians were
Jailbird.
Everybody figured out that Bill Clinton must have had something to do with the allowing the parole officer to let him go. Right? So he took a little bit of brunt in that connection also.
Yeah, you sure did take the brunt of that.
When you hear them attack Putin Putin and the Russians and Trump, they're really saying LaRouche. I mean, ultimately, that's their greatest fear, is if Trump takes LaRouche,
Like Reagan took LaRouche.
yeah, we're gonna get this crisis solved. So we're very close, potentially. I mean, the potential is there.
All right, we'll continue chapter 3 next week.
Okay.